You.
Technology has made us all much more patient. I'm going to say that's the positive with this. I don't freak out anymore. It's like, oh, well, it happens. So this is, and thank you, Mike, by the way. This is just some tips for you. If you want to use a consistent template, you can do it like this. You don't have to, but it does make it a lot more consistent and easier to read, I have found, if you use this. And I think it's easier for staff to read as well. I'm going to go through these next couple of slides, just giving you some examples of policies that you may want to have in place. You don't have to have every one of them, but most agencies do, and I think it is important to have these policies that we're pointing out. There's a lot, and you are going to get these slides, so you don't have to memorize them all. And some of these on this slide are policies that don't necessarily need procedures. Policies that need procedures are your program policies, your operation and client policies around implementing specific things. That's where you want your procedures. Some of these, in terms of your non-discrimination, many of your HR policies, your organizational mission, volunteer, some of those policies don't necessarily need specific procedures. In terms of productivity requirements, you may want both. So your overall, what does productivity mean to your agency? Why do you have it? How is it important in billing or revenue producing? General, you don't necessarily want your productivity billing requirements in your policy because that may change. And again, you don't want to have to go to the board every time that changes, but just a general idea of why it's important to have productivity requirements and the amount of funding and revenue that it brings to the agency and why that's important, and that each program will implement their own standard for productivity. You can have something like, say something like that in a policy. And then each program can set their own procedure based on the revenue they need, if they're scattered site, if they're single site, how many case managers they have, what's the caseload. So you set your productivity based on that. So this is a lot, there's a lot here. I'm just gonna wait a quick second and let you all read this. I'm not gonna read it to you, but I think it is important that you look through these. And again, you'll get these slides, so you'll have documentation of what policies are important to have. I'm going to talk about HIPAA in a minute. As I said, it's going to be a high-level overview. One of the things I do want to point out about the records request is I think that, again, is an important policy and procedure to have. It's really important that all staff understand when a record is requested. Clients are allowed, that is a right, they are allowed to look at their record. And it's important that you have a policy around that and a procedure. And that really should be looked at, I also think, just like HIPAA, that should be looked at by maybe someone expert in that field or an attorney to make sure that you are following all of the HIPAA guidelines and rules and rights of your client. And that's something that staff need to be trained on. I always say when a record request comes in or a crisis happens, is not the time to start training on that policy and procedure. You want to make sure staff understand and are confident and comfortable with what those procedures are. Same with the health emergencies. When it happens is not the time you want to all of a sudden start training people. You want people to know what it is. And then on the client services side, you see it's a little bit of a different focus. It's more about clients and it's more about program specific. You see the critical incident, safety and risk management. At Volunteers of America, we actually, because we had a lot of residential programs. We had halfway houses, transitional housing, we had shelters, we had family supportive housing, so lots of residential and housing programs. So we had a separate safety manual, in a separate safety meeting because there was we had a lot of risk, and you want to look at your risk. You want to mitigate your risk as much as possible. So we actually assigned someone to be our risk manager, and then we had separate risk management and safety meetings. Depending on your agency, you may or may not need that. We felt like we did need that. We were also in many areas of the state, so it was a big agency. We covered a lot of the state of Ohio. So that helped us feel better, and we felt like it was best practice. And when we got CARF accreditation, they also liked that as well. So you can decide for yourself, do you want a separate safety manual or risk management manual, or can it just be part of your policies and procedures, depending on what you need? As you're looking through these lists, if there's any questions that you have about any of them, just again, ask in the chat or write it down and ask it later if you want to.
We have a question in the chat, Terry. It's would you say that operations, policies, and procedures should be FCS specific, or I'm assuming this means should they be FCS specific or more broad in general for all of the programs? Yeah. If they have multiple programs.
Right. So the more you can standardize it across the board, the better. I think you want to definitely make sure they're FCS compliant and specific. But I think in general, you also need to look at all your other funders and requirements or certifications or accreditations. It's a lot easier to do everything across the board. So if, you know, a VOA, if our shelter needed something, but our family program didn't, it was just easier for us to make it standardized across the board, unless it was really too cumbersome for the shelter to do some of those things. But the more consistent you can have for staff, especially if staff rotate between programs, the easier it is for them to follow. On the other hand, you don't want it to be too onerous for staff either. Was that your question?
Yes, you answered my question. Thank you.
Okay, great. The other thing I want to say is FCS, and I'm sure Rayanne can weigh in as well. Maybe not all of these are required for them, or they may not look at all of them, but I will say these are all best practices. And it's really important that you look at all of these policies and procedures and address them in some way. So quality reviews are important to follow up to make sure you're being compliant, and you can set these up however makes sense, again, for your agency. When I started at Volunteers of America, they didn't even have a quality improvement person. And so we literally started from scratch. And now I've been gone from there for probably 10 or 11 years. Now they have a really extensive quality improvement department. And so they've really come a long way, and it's been helpful for them and helpful for their compliance and their programs, their funding, and making sure that they have all of those things in place. So it's helpful. And if no one is looking at your policies and procedures, then nothing will get done. So you really want someone to be looking at them, reviewing them, making sure they're on the calendar if the board needs to approve them, making sure it's on the calendar to be reviewed in terms of procedures, making sure you check in with staff. Are these policies and procedures working like we thought? If not, what needs to be changed? Who's going to change it? Who's going to follow up that it's changed? And who's going to follow up that the change is actually working? So there's all of these little pieces in the puzzle that if you're not on top of each of them, they'll fall through the cracks and never get done. And if you end up having a fidelity review or some kind of audit, that's not the time that you want those things to come to light. You want to make sure you do it on your own. We already talked about mortality and critical incident reviews. That's important in your overall policy to state why you're doing it and what you're doing. Again, in the procedure, you may want to define what is a critical incident, of course, mortality, what is maybe a lower level incident, because you don't want staff making those subjective decisions on that kind of thing. And then internal monitoring, which we're going to talk about. It's also important to make sure your policies are equitable. And I just want to highlight the difference between the words equity and equality. Equity is something that is fair and just to each individual. Equality is really more about being the same to everyone. And we want to make sure our policies and our procedures are equitable to our staff and to our clients. An example that we like to give is that equity in terms of salary, let's say, equity is depending on your experience and your position and your tenure, your salary should be based on that. And with equality, it would be across the board, everyone receives the same pay. So and the same with supervision. Supervision would be the equality in supervision would be you treat everyone the same. You have the same hour-long individual supervision with everyone. Everyone attends group, and you do it all in the same way. And we know that everyone is different depending, again, on their level of experience, their tenure, what do they need? So one staff person who's maybe been there for 3 years, maybe you see them every other week, or maybe you do supervision in a different way. Someone who's new may want to see more than once a week. So, and check in with them, or have more formal once a week and check in with them more often in between times. That's equity. So you want to make sure that you are, and the tenants are the same. You want to make sure you're treating everyone with justice and fairness to that particular person, and that their individual needs are being met. Okay, HIPAA. There's quite a few slides on HIPAA. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly. Of course, it's all about protected health information, PHI. You are a covered entity. Medicaid is a medical insurance, even with the waiver. So it is important that you understand that you are a covered entity and that the information that you have is protected. The client information is protected. This is the definition of PHI. This is why we have HIPAA, to protect that information of that client. And there's also some good resources here, links here on the slide. So HIPAA, first of all, on the left side is key terms. We've already talked about protected health information, confidentiality. HIPAA states, even in an organization, your own organization, you may have case management, you may have property management. They may be one organization, they might be separate organizations. You may have housing case managers, and then you may have counselors, nurses, so all different levels of staff working with your particular client. Within your organization, you are certainly allowed to discuss information about your client to have better client care, to assure continuity of care and ongoing care for your client. So HIPAA doesn't really want to make challenges and barriers to client care, but they're trying to protect the information of the client. And that's where confidentiality comes into play. And your releases of information. So you can call them a consent form or a release of information. They should be as specific as possible. Back in the old days, years and years ago, we used to have releases of information that just said continuity of care and discuss progress of treatment or something. And that's a little too broad. So it's really best practice is to have sections in your release of information that you can check and have the client initial each one, or you can just write it out and have the client sign it. And then that would protect you when you speak to them. When you're dealing with property management and case management or social services, it's important that you create a boundary. So property management does not need to know clients' diagnoses or behavioral health treatment or medication. Maybe they don't need to know what their service plan looks like, only that they have a service plan. So it's important to make that distinction between the property management or landlord and social services. EPHI is your electronic health information, and held, that's the data that you hold, and then the data you transmit to your biller or your state required data that you are different. So HIPAA also says that you need to maintain reasonable privacy. So you don't have to go crazy with what guidelines to put in place. Again, if you consult with someone who has done this and knows what is required and what reasonable is, that they can help you. But reasonable safeguards to protect your policy. You want to make sure that you've got passwords, that everything is password protected, that maybe you have, if your computer isn't being used for 3 minutes, it goes to your screensaver. So those kinds of things are what we would call reasonable. And then with your IT, you need to get your IT and your security involved, because you want to have reasonable protections against any threats inside in terms of your IT. I know here at CSH, our IT person does a mock spam and see who opens links that they shouldn't open. And sometimes we do really good and sometimes we don't. So you want to make sure that you've got things in place to protect yourself from any of those risks. One other thing I wanted to say about landlords is it is important, again, to have that release of information with landlords, and it should be as specific as possible. I think sometimes landlords or property managers, maintenance, even in a good way, or maybe the spirit of what they're doing is meant well, so they want to hear about what their clients are going through. And I've actually heard people say, well, if I knew that the client had mental health issues or what their diagnosis was, I would be able to be more empathetic with them and give them, more chances. And I would just say, you could be as empathetic as you need to be without knowing that, and as compassionate as you can be without knowing all of that information. If the client wants the landlord to know it, that's another conversation. But in general, keep your release of information really specific about the behavior of the client, that you'll be talking about ways that will keep their housing secure, but not necessarily any of their medical diagnoses. So these are their rights that the clients have. And again, it's here for you to look at. Remember that they do have a right to look at their chart. Remember, we talked about having a records request policy. When a client asks to look at something, that's not when you want the staff person to start getting trained. You want the staff person to know what your agency policy and procedure is around that. And they have the right to file a complaint or a grievance, just like staff have a right to file a complaint or a grievance. And you should have policies around both, that your clients or tenants and your staff filing grievances. I am next week going to do a training on documentation. And one of the things I like to say is, when you're writing your notes, remember this, that clients have a right to see their notes and their charts. It helps you write a little bit more objective note. So I think we talked about this already. You are considered a covered entity. Your client records, whether they're electronic or paper or both. I don't know if all of you do have electronic records already, but the reasonable steps and reasonable ways to ensure that security is covered, whether you have paper or whether you have electronic. And then steps you can take. So some of the things, some tips that we have, automatic logout. So if your laptop or your computer's not being used for 3 minutes or whatever, then it goes to your screensaver, making sure that you have passwords. Do the passwords change often? I know that's a pain, but that's a little bit more of a protection. If you're in a single site and your offices are close to each other, you could use noise machines. If you have paper records, make sure those files are locked, and it's good to have them in a locked office as well, and one that is more maybe out of the way. So if you have paper files, don't have your file cabinet with your client records in your office. Again, I know that's a pain, but it should be in an area that is off limits or out of the way, that clients don't come in and out, and you're not opening a drawer with other client files in there in front of clients. So it should be somewhere off in a little bit more remote area. I've seen this, and so I caution against it because I've seen it. Don't have Post-it notes all over your computer screen or your monitor with all your passwords on it, or at your desk with all your passwords on it. Make sure that they're also in a safe place. The scattered site it creates a lot of issues and challenges in its own. You know, really the best security is if our home-based or housing-based case managers have laptops or tablets that are password protected, so they can write in their chart exactly at that time. You know, some clients are fine with you writing your notes right there, and when you're done with your home visit, you're totally done. You've already written your note. If you can't do that, or if you do still have paper charts, you can just bring blank pages, blank papers, have your service plans with you when you're going to a particular client's house. Take the name of the client off and just label it however, so you know what client it is, and then you can put that back in when you're back at the office. Or if there is a centralized location that's close to your scattered site, you can have maybe an off-site place where you can store your records. It is a little bit more challenging for that kind of thing. One thing I'm going to say is you can't depend on your memory. You can't visit 3 clients in a row without taking some kind of notes and remember what you talked about. So it's important to develop your own style and whatever works for you, that you can remember what you're doing and who you're doing it with, and keep your information as secure as possible. And again, it's really important to train staff so that all staff are doing it consistently. One of the things we discovered, because we were all scattered site at Volunteers of America, is that everyone was doing something different because we didn't have a policy around it. And, you know, we never asked, how is everyone doing this? And we discovered everyone was just doing it however worked for them. So we had a more consistent policy around making sure everything is kept secure. We actually bought our staff little locked file cabinets that they could keep in their cars, and did some other things. We weren't to the point where we could do tablets, unfortunately. So when you're in a single site, you have similar but different barriers and issues. You want to make sure that you're not talking about clients in the hallway. And a lot of times what happens is tenants will come up to you and start talking about another tenant in the hallway because they did something that irritated them or upset them. So you need to move them out of that public place into your office or into a private place and private space to continue that conversation. But don't get hooked into answering something right away when you're in a public place. And same with staff. If the copier is in a public place or front desk, maybe something happened the night before and the front desk staff want to tell you, and they're telling you in the middle of, because maybe they can't leave their spot, and they're telling you when there's a lot of people coming and going and walking in and out. You want to make sure that you have that conversation. It's important to have those conversations, but have it in a more private space. And again, make sure that the front desk staff are trained on that, about that and why that's important. So here's just, again, some helpful tips for you as you are implementing HIPAA and looking at HIPAA policies. I think performing a risk analysis of your current policies and what that entails, someone from the outside coming in and looking at it would be helpful. Absolutely designating a person. I always say the same thing when I talk about quality improvement as well. If you don't have a quality improvement manager specialized to that position, you will not get as much done and your quality improvement program will not be as robust as you may want it to be. If you take a program director who is already probably more than full-time responsibilities and say, oh, by the way, you're also going to be our HIPAA compliance person or our client rights officer or our quality improvement manager, you will get exactly that. You will get a quarter of a person who's already overworked trying to implement something that they won't be able to do as well as they should be. I realize making that investment is maybe not in the budget, but it will be worth it in the long run because you will have a much more robust program. Again, I want to point out the Office of the Inspector General in terms of their website and how they can help in terms of compliance and forms and templates. And so, and CMS as well, their website as well. All right, any questions about HIPAA? I probably overwhelmed everyone. So just thinking for yourself, and please share in the chat, and thinking for yourself in your own agency, where do you think you stand in terms of reviewing your policies and procedures, and what do you think you need more specifically? So just give you a second to think about that. And feel free to write it in the chat as well. I know as Volunteers of America, we were definitely deficient in our incident reporting, which is why I use that as an example. Policies, our HIPAA policies, we didn't have any restraint. Even though we didn't do physical restraint, we needed a policy that said that. That was specific to Ohio. You may not need that. But there's a lot of policies that we were deficient in, and it would really helped us to be able to have that table that showed. Are you all familiar enough with your policies to know what you need?
Yeah, I asked about the capacity building grant for a reason. Yeah, we got a lot more to work on, but that's good. You know, at least we know that now, and that's exciting.
Yeah. It was just a local, and the reason they liked it because local foundations like to do the one and done. They don't like to fund ongoing programs. So they really liked that this was a very contained, we needed it for a year. There was a specific thing we wanted and an outcome. And so it fit right in.
Yeah, it's very validating
Mm-hmm.
for a funder, yeah.
All right, if anybody wants to share about their policies.
There's in the chat, I think we have good policies in place, but no strong procedures for monitoring how we're doing and following them. We rely too much on audits and incident reporting to identify compliance problems.
Yeah, great point, and thanks for sharing that. No one likes audit, no one likes internal monitoring, and we're going to talk about that. But as I said to the staff constantly, much better that we find our own mistakes than someone come in, especially the state. The local people might be a little more lenient, but if the state comes in, we don't want them to find our mistakes. We want to find our own. So no one likes it. The staff grumbled about it, but they finally, the first time we got an audit and we did well, all of a sudden the staff were thanking us for making sure that everything was in compliance. So great point. Okay, so moving on to open lines of communication. I want to point out two types of communication I think is important. One is one that I've been talking about, I think, since the beginning, and that is how do you share information about anything that's happening in your or in your organization, whether it's your new policies, whether it's procedures, whether it's accreditation, new billing. How do you communicate that? And if you are a senior staff person or you're part of an executive team here on this call, how do you know that it's being done? So do you want to do it at staff meetings, and do you look at staff meeting minutes? So not just making sure that the communication is happening, but again, closing that loop, making sure that you as an executive team member know how that communication is happening and have confirmation that it's happening. I did a technical assistance consulting work with an organization here in Columbus, and I talked with probably 10 or 12 staff, and none of them, 0% or 100%, knew where their policy manual was or had their supervisor talk to them about it. You don't want that to be the answer if someone would ask your staff about your policy manual. At least you would want them to say, I can ask my supervisor who could find it out for me. But not knowing anything about it, or that it was just revised, or where to ask, is not the answer that you want. So you want to make sure those lines of communication about policy changes or training or anything is happening, so that you know you have that procedure and that policy guideline, and that it's being followed. The other type of communication I want to talk about is a mechanism in place to have staff and client grievances. So both. You want to make sure you have a line of communication open without retaliation, that there is a person that staff can go to. It could be HR or not, but it could be someone within HR. But that process is accessible, is known, and that there's something in your policy that states specifically there will be no retaliation to staff if they have a grievance against someone, their supervisor or coworker. So you want to make sure that's in your policy, and you want to make sure you follow those lines of communication. Same with your tenants or your clients. You want to make sure there's a grievance procedure and policy in place, or appeal. You can call it one or the other. If they if they're at risk of eviction, or if they get some notice that that there is a way that they can communicate or appeal or grieve that decision. You want to make sure those are really clear. And then it talks about board communication on this slide too. You do want to make sure that there is regular communication with the board. Agencies do that many different ways. I think it's good for the board to have some communication with staff and some information about programs. I've seen boards from one extreme to the other, where they know nothing about the programs that they're actually a board of directors for, that it's totally fiscal fundraising, and there's this big disconnect with those. And then I've seen boards on the total other end where they're too involved in programs. I think there's a good balance between, you want your board of directors to care about the programming and be committed to the board that they're serving on. Not be so involved, but not be totally disengaged either. So what we did at Volunteers of America that I think worked well is every quarter we had a program director come and for 15 minutes describe their program, what goals they were working on that year, their outcomes, and it allowed the program director to meet the board and allowed the board to meet that person. So that was a good way, kind of back and forth. Okay, internal monitoring. Any questions about any of those other things before we go to internal monitoring?
Yeah, I had a question. Can we refer clients to like a third-party ombuds office
Mhm.
policies? Just to offload that and give them that anonymity option. Is that okay to do?
I would do both.
Okay,
I would do one. I wouldn't just do the external, but
okay,
that, I mean, that would be a great asset to your grievance procedure,
okay.
that they could also do that, because I would think every county has that. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I think the
thanks for,
healthcare authority has one.
that's a great idea too. So again, remember, internal monitoring, no one likes, but it is important that we find our own mistakes. And there's many different types of reviews and internal monitoring you can do. This is specific to a chart review. So this is specific to looking at charts. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some other kinds of reviews you can do as well. Some of the things that you should think about is the timing and the frequency. So depending on how many clients you serve in a year, you may want to do a chart review quarterly for half a day and do 10% of your charts. If you're just starting out, so VOA, when we started billing Medicaid, we started from scratch. We had nothing. Progress notes were barely written. So I had to look at a lot of progress notes, and I did them all the time. So we couldn't do anything quarterly or even monthly. I had to look at every progress note for probably three months. Hopefully you guys are a little bit more ahead of the game than that, and you may want to do it monthly for the first 6 months and then move to quarterly. So depending on where you sit and what your charts look like and what your notes look like and your service plans, you can time it, the timing and the frequency, depending on what makes sense for you. The other thing that's important is who's going to be looking at it. With the state of Ohio, we had to have a peer review and we had to have kind of a checklist. So if we had, and we did, this was traditional Medicaid billing, so it was had a lot more guidelines and requirements than your waiver. But so we had someone look at all of the forms and making sure everything was checked. So if we looked at a progress note, was there a date? Was there a service plan goal attached to it? Was it signed? Did it have next steps? And anyone can do that. Anyone can say yes or no. Yep, or no. The quality review in terms of, was it Medicaid compliant? Did it have information in there about intervention, client progress? So a more qualitative review, reading the actual note, had to be done by a peer. So if it was a bachelor's level person or higher, or master's level person had to be doing that review. So designating the type of review and the type of staff who are doing the review is going to be important. You don't want it to be too onerous on any one person. And you could have outside people. So Mike's question in terms of outside people, you could, as long as you have the right security in place and the confidentiality agreements in place, you could have outside people do your review, your qualitative reviews as well, if it's too time consuming for staff. You can pick out a specific number of the charts that you want to review. You want to have a process for correcting the mistakes. Again, you need to close that loop. You need to make sure, as for executive staff who are on this call, you need to make sure that you know that mistakes are being corrected. If you've got progress notes that are not signed, if you have certain elements of a progress note that you should have in place that aren't there with any chart, if the time isn't there, then you need to have a process in place that corrects that. So one could be the reviewer highlights the mistakes, gives that feedback to the staff person within, say, 24 hours of the review happening, then that staff person has 2 business days to correct the mistake, if it's possible. Sometimes clients are discharged and there's mistakes and it can't be fixed. So that's another issue. But let's say it can be. So the staff has two business days to fix that mistake. Then it goes back to the reviewer. The reviewer checks to make sure, yep, changes. So we actually scored the reviews that we did. That's the reviewer reviews it again, increases their score to hopefully 100%. Then that, not the whole chart, but just that review form goes to the supervisor. So the supervisor, when they get it, can see the steps that were taken. They can see that what the score originally was, what was corrected, that it was corrected, and so they can see all of the steps. That's just one option for you. Those mistakes can go directly to the supervisor, and then the supervisor can take care of it from that point on and give it to the staff person to correct. And then the supervisor keeps the summary of all the mistakes that were corrected. So however, whatever works for you, as long as you have that process and that loop is closed so that you know the mistakes are being corrected. I know FCS is really serious about housing choice and making sure that that's part of what you do with your clients. So that would be something you might want to look at, or looking at all of those things that they look at in their fidelity reviews. You may want to have that checklist and have that part of your internal monitoring as well. So some things that you can do to help with your internal monitoring. We had, and I don't think this is the case for FCS, but in Ohio, we billed per minute, per unit. So every 15 minutes was a unit. So we also did a billing review. And what we did was we took the 5% highest utilizers for that quarter. So, and we did that because the state of Ohio said they were going to look at our high utilizers. So we decided maybe we should look at them too. So the 5% of highest utilizers for that month or that quarter of billing, we looked at those individuals, those clients, and we checked a few things. We checked making sure that the amount that we billed for was found in the progress note. So if a case manager saw that client 4 times for an hour each time, just to make my math easy, and for that month we billed 4 hours, which would be, I think, 16 units or whatever it would be, making sure that we billed whatever we billed that month, we actually saw the client for that amount of time. We also made sure that the beginning and end time was on the note so that the auditor would find it very easy to see how much time was spent. And if that wasn't the case, then we would have to go to the case manager and figure out what happened. If in fact we billed incorrectly, we would send in a new bill. And if we had to reconcile, or if we had to take money away, again, better that we do it, even though it was a pain and we didn't like to do it, better that we found the mistake and rectified it and reconciled our billing rather than someone else come in. So we actually did, some of the time, we did bill incorrectly and we had to take that back. So you want to plan and you want to make sure that you're identifying your risks. There's a difference between trends. So do none of your intake forms have the fact that there is some choice for clients, or do none of your intake forms include your service plan, your assessment, whatever it should include? That's a trend. That's something you want to fix and find out what is the reason for that and fix that and follow up on that. If it's just 1 or 2 mistakes, I wouldn't go out of my way to make a big deal about it. In terms of corrective action, just fix that particular mistake. So there's a big difference between a trend and just mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. That's why we do internal monitoring. We're all human. We all make mistakes. It happens. And we just fix them. But if you do find, for whatever reason, maybe the supervisor forgot to tell everyone to include the specific thing on your intake form, then you need to fix that trend and make sure that it isn't continuing to happen. Is there data that you're supposed to be collecting that you're not collecting? That's a really important discovery to find out. And sooner better than later to fix that, so you're collecting the correct data. So those kinds of things are really important for you to track and enforce in terms of corrective action. And if it's with a specific program, then you need to do whatever you need to do to get that program back up to compliance standards. And I'm going to say a couple things about reporting. One is if there's external parties that do need to be consulted, then you need to write those reports. When we were starting out with Volunteers of America and starting out monitoring and we looked at everything. We looked at chart reviews, documentation, outcomes, data. And then we were just discussing it as a quality improvement team, but we weren't giving any feedback to the programs or the staff. Again, I have no idea why. It sounded good in theory, but and so the staff gave us that feedback. They said, we want to know how we're doing, which made perfect sense. So we started doing internal reporting to the programs and meeting with the programs quarterly to tell them how they were doing this quarter. What did they do better on? What trends did we find? And it worked out much better, and the staff had a higher level of buy-in and commitment and engagement with the entire process too. So it was a really good way for us to provide input to them. Okay, any other questions before I move on? And I'm going to get some water. Okay, we are almost done. Probably will be done a little early, maybe. All right, so training and education is part of the other compliance standards that we're going to talk about. And there's lots of different kinds of training and lots of different ways to do it. These are just some recommendations for you to think about when you're thinking about your training. I have a saying that I say everywhere, and that is, one training does not an expert make. So when you are thinking about your training and education programs, you need to think about that ongoing learning in terms of supervision, case conferencing, peer meetings, group supervision, group meetings, role playing, continuing education. We can't just train our staff one time and say, oh, we're good now. If you don't practice, you're not going to be able to implement those important interventions with your clients. And staff need to be supported in that as well. So think about that when you're thinking broadly about your training and education program. It's important to continue to tweak and check in with staff when you can. Use those real life examples. I'm going to talk about some onboarding in terms of, first 90 days and et cetera in a second. It's important to maintain some documentation. So I would imagine all of your training actual requirements for the state will require some documentation. You can keep it with HR, or you can have the supervisor keep the documentation. You can have both. I used to tell employees at Volunteers of America that they should keep their own certificates and give it to HR as well. So we had a double help there. One of the things we also did at Volunteers of America that I think was helpful is the HR department volunteered to provide our family services department with all of the training that was required and when it was due for each staff person. So we had local requirements and state requirements, and they put them all in a table and had our staff person's names and their hire date. So the first 90 days, this was required for these staff, and then 6 months, and then annually. And when that was due, So, and they gave their program director a 30-day or 60-day notice that the staff person's coming up on their annual date, and this training is now due for them. Super helpful for the family program director. You can do a pre-post test with your training. You could do only a post test if you wanted to check knowledge. It's better than nothing at all. Training doesn't always have to be a formalized training that you send someone out to. You can bring someone in. It could, again, be done through supervision. It doesn't have to be some outside person either. These are some recommendations for things that you could do as you're onboarding staff. The important thing is that you have an onboarding policy that you follow. So one of the worst things that we can do for staff is have them come in and they feel unwelcome. They don't know where their office is. They don't have a computer yet. You know, they need, it's important for them to feel welcome, to feel part of the team right from the get-go. So having an onboarding policy is really more important than what you put in it, that you have a policy and that it is followed. Again, for the executive people on this call, how are you going to know that your onboarding policy and your onboarding training requirements are being followed? You need to make sure that you have that in place, that you know it's being followed. So these are just some things that you can do in that first month. It is important for them to know. It's also important for them to know how to start writing progress notes right away too. But if we can, we do tend to throw people in because staff turnover is very difficult, and everyone is seeing more clients than their own, and they're all pitching in, and they're all tired. So when a new staff person comes on, we're tired of seeing extra clients. But it is important to spend that extra month. Maybe they can shadow, they can learn, they can read, but allowing them that time to come in, be welcome, feel part of the team, learn their job, learn what they're doing is a really great investment in people, in your people. First 90 days, again, these are just some recommendations for you. You'll have these slides. And you can do these trainings, and however, sometimes it's reading and they can just sign that they read it. If it's your HR manual, your policy manual, if it's a safety manual, we had to have elder abuse and child abuse mandates that we had websites that they read and they just signed that they read them. You can do it however you want in terms of making sure that they get all of these. Some of the trainings are more involved than others. For example, de-escalation and client conflict resolution. Those are a little bit more in depth and maybe need an outside person, or at least beginning the review of what that means. And then the first year or annual, these are, again, are some trainings for you. And I would say, again, it's important that you not have a one and done way of training people, because if you don't practice these interventions, then you will become stale at them. Just like if we don't practice anything, then we don't become better at it. So we do need to practice and make sure that we help staff and support staff in all of these trainings. We do have a whole series on supervision, which I would highly recommend if any of you are interested, but just a word about it here. And I think you've heard it from me for the last hour. It's important we support our staff. It's important that supervisors maintain constant communication so we know how our staff are doing, making sure we have that equity lens with our staff and giving them the type of supervision, the frequency of supervision that they need, that each one specifically needs, so it's individualized to them. We also recommend that you do a combination of individual and group supervision so that staff are getting individualized attention for their own staff development goals and their own issues that they want to work with privately, but that they're also getting the benefit of hearing from their peers around different things as well. Two things that we did at Volunteers of America with our group supervision that I think was very successful. One was that I allowed staff, when they were interested in a specific topic, to do research on it and then present it to the staff. I didn't decrease their productivity requirements during that month or take anything away from them, but it was something that they were interested in doing and wanted to do research on it and present to their fellow teammates about it. It worked really well, and staff really, really enjoyed it. Then the other thing we did, which hopefully a lot of you do, is also bringing to the team problems that they're having with specific clients. I think sometimes when we're frustrated about a client, sometimes we can't think creatively and we feel like we're hitting a brick wall. And fresh eyes, fresh thoughts, fresh brain can look at the same client and the same situation and come up with some really good ideas for that staff person. So we also did that, which was super helpful. You could also have outside people come and present and do training that way with your group supervision, but the combo of individual and group is really important. The other good thing about group is that when there are policy changes or issues that as an agency you need to impart, whatever those maybe administrative things are, you can tell everyone at the same time, everyone hears the same thing, everyone has the ability to ask questions, everyone hears the questions and hears the answers in the same way. So when you have administrative things to communicate, policy changes, Medicaid billing changes, it's good to do that in the group. And case conferencing is very similar to bringing challenging clients to the table, but that could include other people as well. It could include support people. It sometimes even could include the client, him or herself, if that is what the client wants, but specific about a client to talk about what issues and where can we go and next steps and create a plan of action for that. Also, one other thing quickly, and that is when something negative happens, if a client overdoses or a client actually dies, or if a client gets evicted or gets terminated from the program, those things affect staff. And you can case conference around that as well. You can debrief, you can have a period of time where everyone vents about it. And that is important too for staff to be able to know that they can do that and to be able to share those feelings. It's important that we don't ignore that because those things that they can be very traumatic to staff and other clients as well. So having that time for other tenants, if your neighbor just overdosed, could be really impact you. So having that for them as well. So just some things for you to think about as you're thinking about your policies and procedures. Policies, again, are the big, broad overview. They should be reviewed by the board, flexible enough to be broad so you don't have to always change them, but the procedures are the steps that you take to follow that procedure, that policy. I would review policies annually. When you first implement a procedure, I would review it more often. I would not wait a whole year. Or if you're implementing something that is very new, I would do it at least that first quarter. And then I think it's important for you to develop your own plan of education and communication and training for staff.
Great, thank you. You killed it, Terry. Such a good job. We have one question in the chat. Christine, if you wanted to come off mute and ask it, or I can read it, whatever works for you. There's a little bit of time left over for us to chat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
How you doing? I was
All
just
right.
listening over your lovely speech of administration and supervision. So I'm thinking, being a client for so long, I see this revolving door of staff. And in the reservation, I see that there's listening to your speech today, the reservation for supervision and administration and foundational support. I found it all very, very important. So I think having a concept of business relevance and then group theory is kind of like really fascinating subject. So I was just asking, within the system of administration and supervision and court indoctrination, from peer relevance and support, I think you followed through with a lot of technical advision, and I think the advisory notice and things from patient and clientele to hold a relevant position is really important. And I think just hopefully not sweeping under the table like a lot of the things, interrogation and corporate espionage, or now you watch spy movies, of course, but within the relevance, there has to be a direction for staffing and literacy in the company. So like whether or not support is going to be relevant or irrelevant, and having a definition of that. I'm just kind of rambling because it was pretty inspiring to say, like Girl Scouts and camping and taking the next initiative. Are you going to do the recovery door where people are open to, to state their reservations and their necessities and the cause of the infliction, or the point of reference. I think it's really important. A lot of that. I was just, okay, I'm done. I get shy really quickly because I know I need support as well, and trying to find a hiring potential and staff legitimacy as a founder or owner, and then having all of these really great inferences and ideas is great until it's initiated. So that's all I'm saying. It's taking the initiative kind of.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing, coming off mute. I think it's brave to do that, so I appreciate it. And I think it's easy to get frustrated and discouraged. We're all overworked, supervisors and staff alike. And I think it's easy to get task oriented and focus on exactly what do I need to do today, and not look at the big picture of what's going to keep my program running in the best way possible. And so and I'm not sure if that's what you were referring to, but I think it is really important that we don't get caught up in that muck of getting stuck in the everyday and getting overwhelmed, but taking a step back to say, how can I best sustain staff? How can I best sustain the quality of my program? And investing in that as an organization, as a supervisor, as staff, as peers, as clients, to have everyone be investing in that quality. Everyone should be on the same page with that and help and support each other in that, because it's easy to get caught up in our everyday bazillion things that we have to do.
If I can just chime in, I just wanted to say, Christine, like I'm a nationally certified peer counselor, and I've been through the consumer ringer that you're talking about. And there's a lot of retaliation, there's a lot of poor quality care, there's a lot of not getting what you need, not being heard. And I totally want to validate and elevate what you're saying. And as a leader, and now I feel the importance of ensuring that there's third-party measures to ensure that there's no retaliation from any individual or any organization in this type of work, because the voices of the people closest to the problems are the voices that will lead us to the solutions to these problems. So it's important that we give them and give ourselves the support that we need to get there. So I just want to thank you for sharing that. I think it's important.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for that clarification too, and validation.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing. Does anybody else have any comments, any questions? No pressure at all to come off mute, you put it in the chat. And the chat says we're a smaller agency, but for us, setting aside Monday mornings for an hour-long all-staff meeting, then having staff meet individually with supervisors to discuss caseload specifics has been really helpful in planning out our week, providing each other support where needed, etc. Because the rest of the week we are off and running. Yeah, so building in some time for that, for those conversations and that support, I think is really important. I think
Great.
it's
Yeah, thank
like,
you.
yeah, like you said, the rest of the week is busy, right? If you don't carve out that time and if you're not intentional about it, it's hard to just squeeze it in when you have so much other stuff going on. Yeah,
A quick
thank
word
you
about
all.
staff meetings. I think staff meetings are important. Staff meetings are a little different than group supervision. I have been asked
Mhm.
that before. You can do them both. You can have, a case conferencing and supervision of staff and do announcements and do training. It might make it a longer meeting. The important thing is that you have an agenda that everyone is aware of, so everyone knows what to expect at this meeting, whether it's Monday morning or when it is, that you start on time and you end on time. No one wants to waste time at meetings. No, you don't want your staff to say, to not want to come to the meeting because it always goes over. So starting and ending on time is important. I would also recommend having minutes and having follow-up. And I would recommend rotating those positions. If you have the person taking the minutes, then you can have them send it to the person who's designated as the follow-up if there's any action item. And sharing that role, not always having it be the supervisor, sharing that role will help build some skills of staff, and as well will share that burden of that, so it's not always on one person.
Mhm. All right, folks. Well, thank you so much for joining. We have another
Yeah.
session with Terry and the Mayor Group next week, Tuesday at 9:30. This QR code, if you put your phone to it, you can register through that. If you don't have next week's registration already or the calendar invite already on your calendar, message me separately and I can forward you the registration link. And then we also have our feedback survey here. So if y'all wouldn't mind taking the time to let us know how we did, that would be great.
do.
We would love to hear back from you. But yeah, we'll see you next week. I'm gonna put my email in the chat for you all. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And like I said, if you don't have access to next week's link already, I'll send it to you. I also a little bit earlier in the chat, put in the link to our extranet that has all of the previous sessions and all of the previous documentation linked in there. So feel free to browse and forward any of that stuff off as you need it. But thank you all for joining. I'm gonna stop recording. I'm
Thank you
gonna
all.
leave it open.